British poet Tony Harrison was born in Leeds, Yorkshire in 1937. He was educated at Leeds Grammar School and the University of Leeds, where he took a BA in classics. He has also done postgraduate work in linguistics. He has lectured at Ahmadu Bello University in northern Nigeria and at Charles University in Prague. At present, he is resident dramatist at the National Theatre. Tony Harrison has published 5 books of verse and is also well known for his adaptations of Lysistrata, Le Misanthrope, and Phèdre. He has received several awards for his writing, including a UNESCO Fellowship in 1969 and the Faber Memorial Award in 1972. Tony Harrison has been called one of the most accomplished technicians of his generation. He begins, says the critic, with an idea or a theme and then clothes it with his verbal imagination. His elegant and originally angled poems work primarily by means of wit in the Ampsonian sense, and their emotional substance is conveyed by means of carefully chosen modes of tone and the form of particular lines. Tony Harrison has a new book forthcoming in October 1978, and he has completed a new English translation of The Bartered Bride on commission for the Metropolitan Opera Company. Tony.
I have to explain, even in England, the title of my book, The Loiners, because people don't know what it means. They tell me a lot of librarians classify it as zoology, and they may have a point. But loiners are people who were born, as I was, in Leeds, in the north of England. And I like to think also there's a God-given pun in the title, because many of my poems are about the way in which people act both as citizens and private individuals, and the way in which they receive the terrors of history in their most private experience. The most private experience is sexual experience. I'm going to read a poem about the end of the war in Leeds. I was 8, and we had a bonfire to celebrate what I then didn't quite understand, but later realized the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And it's a poem about a man in Leeds, and all northern cities have them, maybe all cities have them. He was one of those people we were told not to play with, that children were warned off because he had a sense of threat about him, especially sexual threat. And he shook, his hands shook. He kept his hands in his pockets. That was all that was wrong with him. And we called him Peanut Joe. I think it's because we didn't know the word penis then. But we called him Peanuts Joe, and I kept the word peanuts because he's peanuts in the sense of being worthless, that he wasn't, he didn't fight in the war. And at the Victory bonfire, where the desert rats were dancing around the fire, he exposed himself and was carted off to prison and committed suicide in prison. It's called The Pocket Wars of Peanuts Joe. And it's a sense of suddenly realizing how England, as a part, had passed away. The Pocket War of Peanuts Joe. There's a word, glary, which you probably don't know is a North England word, meaning sticky. I don't know if wanking means anything in America. It means masturbation amongst boys in the north of England. The Pocket Wars of Peanuts Joe. The nuts bit really missed. They didn't guess till after he was dead. Then his sad name was bandied as a dirty backstreet hess, a masturbator they made bear the blame for all dodged swastikas, all filthy scrawl in gents and ladies, yank gome scratched with a chisel on the churchyard wall, the vicar's bogey against wanker's doom. We knew that adult rulers just weren't true. We did it often, but our minds stayed strong. Our palms weren't cold and tacky, and they never grew as telltale matted tangles like King Kong. We knew that what was complicated joy in coupled love, and for lonely men relief, for Joe was fluted rifling, no kid's toy he fired and loaded in his handkerchief. Some said that it was shell shock. They were wrong. His only service was to sing "The Boers Have Got My Daddy" and the veteran song, and gazing in the surplus stores. In allotment dugouts, nervous of attack, ambushing love shadows in the park, his wishes shrapnel, Joe's ack, ejaculio shot through the dark, strewn, churned up trenches in his head. Our combs were colourless, but Joe's froze in whoosh cascados with blood red, each flushed, bare woman to a glare pose. VD Day, jellies, trestle tables, cheers for Ruskies, Yanks and desert rats with guns and braces dangling, drunk, heaped souvenirs, swastikas, Jap tin hats and rising suns. The victory bonfire settled as white ash. The accordion stopped tipperary. It was something solemn, made Joe flash his mitred bishop as they played the king. Happy and glorious, faded away. Swine, the disabled veteran with the medals cried. The ARP tobacconist rang 999. The desert rat stood guard on either side. 2 coppers came. Halston frog-marched poor penis off to a cold clink. He goose-stepped backwards, and crowds saw the cock that could gush Hiroshimas start to shrink. A sergeant found him gutted like a fish on army issue blades, the gormless one, no good for cannon fodder. His last wish bequeathed his gonads to the Pentagon. I have a taste for, because I found it very hard to become a poet, as I was saying this morning. I've always had a taste for those poets who attempted the impossible. I'm thinking of minor poets nobody ever reads, like Dr. Thomas Armstrong, who wrote in Miltonic blank verse, a poem called The Art of Preserving Health, about what to do with your diary, and so on. And I love such attempts to tackle impossible subjects in verse. And this led me to, not only as the poet, but the theme in a book I found when I first to Newcastle, a special medical collection. And I found there a poem written by Fracastorius in 1530 called Syphilis, which is a pastoral poem in Latin hexameters. And it's in fact, as I've begun to read it, it's actually the first poem in European literature of colonial guilt. Because you know, the old myth was that syphilis was brought to Europe by Columbus and his sailors coming back after the discovery of the New World. And syphilologists with computers and a mathematical turn of mind have worked out recently that if that were the case, it would have taken them 30 sailors, about 2 weeks to spread it the length and breadth of Europe, which is clearly a statistical impossibility. But what it does seem to be, I think, when you consider the decimation of the Indian population at that time, that I think they found people who shared their property, who were beautiful, naked, and they took their gold and they raped and killed them. And one of the mechanisms of guilt was such that they constructed the myth of syphilis around the discovery of the New World. It's also that human thing of wanting to always find the worm in the apple. So it seemed like a poem which I could put as a kind of footnote to some of my own poems about experience of post-colonial Africa. And the other thing about Fracastorius, who wrote this poem, Syphilis, or Morbus Gallicus, everybody calls it the French disease or the Japanese disease, according to the nationality it happened to be. It's always somebody else's disease. Was that he was literally born with no mouth in his face, and the surgeons had to open the mouth. And he also died speechless. He's emblematic for me in that sense. So this poem, the sailors who discover the New World, they're on the shore, and a great bird flies out of the rocks and utters a warning to them about taking syphilis back to the old world. And it was written in 1530, and I made it a footnote poem to my own poems. The Bird Speaks. I did it in Terza Rima, actually, because it's like those warning voices out of Dante's Inferno. Westerners who laid the sun's foul low, the flocks of Apollo, now stand and hear the dreadful sufferings you must undergo. This land where you are now is that Ophir your flashy lips show off like jewelry, but not yet yours to own, nor domineer its quiet peoples until now quite free. Cities and new sacraments you won't impose until you've suffered much by land and sea. Cell-lumbered pilgrims of San Lazaro's, brothels and gold bars bring you no joy, porphyry and bring no repose. You'll walk strangers bloodily, destroy or be destroyed. Your discoveries will cost destructions greater than the siege of Troy. Worse wanderings after, or thousands lost. Comrades you fitted out search parties for, hutches of bleached ribs on our bare coast. You'll go on looking, losing more and more to the sea, the climate, weapons, ours and yours. Your crimes abroad brought home a civil war, and also syphilis. Sores, foul sores will drive you back through storm and calenture, crawling lepers to our peaceful shores. The Malays of the West will lure the scapegoats of its ills, you and your crew, back to our jungles, looking for a cure. You'll only find the old world in the new, and you'll rue your descubrimiento, rue it, rue Africa, rue Cuba, rue Peru. And away behind the crags, the dark bird flew, and everything it prophesied came true. When I went to work in Czechoslovakia in 1967, I had to go to an office which was obviously run by the security, and they said, well, chap, off behind the curtain, are we? I said, yeah. He said, well, don't have to tell you, you're a married man, but do watch out for pretty girls and pretty boys and for microphones in your bedroom. And when I found a microphone in my bedroom, I wrote a little poem for it, which is a poem easily memorized so that people can recite it into the microphones of Eastern European bedrooms. It's like a modern equivalent of those samplers people used to weave out of the Bible, you know, like the one from the second book of Isaiah, which says, "Lord, I come quickly." This poem is called "The Bedbug." It's as much about the nature of love as it is about the Cold War. Comrade, with your finger on the playback switch, listen carefully to each love moan, and enter in the file which cry real and which a mere performance for your microphone. I've been, again, recently made a lot of visits to the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, and I've been writing new poems about the experience. And one's a poem which is a regular sonnet and is addressed to American actress Jane Fonda, whom I worked with in Leningrad. And it arises out of a conversation we had about, she was about to go to Cuba, and one of the countries I visited when I got the UNESCO award was Cuba in 1969. I spent 3 months. And we were talking about the position of women in Cuba, the position of poets, that then a friend of mine, Alberto Padilla, had just been put in prison. And men felt very threatened by the condition of women after the revolution. They felt castrated and so on. And we had this discussion about the relation of men and women and poets. And before she left me a present of a glass of rum in which there were floating pink guavas, which are very fleshly. And this is a thank you poem for this gift, which also tries to sum up our conversations about men and women and poets, all in a sonnet. It's called Guava Libre, and it's for Jane Fonda, Leningrad, 1975. Pickled Gold Coast clitoridectomies, Leonora in formaldehyde, a rose-pink death mask of a screen cult kiss, Marilyn's mouth or vulva mummified, lips cropped off a poet. That's more like. That's also the sort of poet I think I am. The lips of Orpheus fished up by a dike, singing of Cuba Libre and Vietnam. The taste, though. Taste. Ah, that could only be women, oh, abajo men. The thought of it's enough to make you come. The honeyed yoni of Eurydice. And I am Orpheus, going down again. Thanks for the guavas soaked in Cuban rum. There's another called Curtain Sonnets. Everywhere, if you want to go to bed with a lady in Russia, and you're in a hotel, you key ladies on all the floors who make sure that you don't do it. And this is a poem addressed to a Russian lady, and it's remembering the act. It's about division. It's about the world being divided, about people being divided by distance and so on, and circumstance. And it remembers the last year I made Leningrad, I was during the white nights when it's dark. And I remembered this when I was in a place in Worcester, which is called Monkwood, Grimley, it happens to be the northern edge for nightingales in the world. And I was rather tight, listening to nightingales at midnight, and remember this lady. And what happened when we joined the market was all of the great Worcester orchards had to be cut down and sage planted in their stead. And that's one of the facts in the poem. The other thing is that I had a room overlooking the Nieva and the battleship Aurora, which fired the first shot in the October Revolution. It also means dawn. It's called The Viewless Wings for Margarita Terekova. The hungry generation's new decree turns Worcester orchards into fields of sage. Tipsy, courtesy, cheap wine and EEC. I hear, as unaware of ours as Keats's age, the same blithe bird, but its old magic fails. And my longing for your is just as bad at England's northern edge for nightingales as those white nights last year in Leningrad, where, packed for my flight back, thick curtains drawn, but night too like full day to get much kip. I wanted you to watch with from bed, that seamless merger of half dusk and dawn. Aurora, rosy-fingered kind, and battleship, whose salvo turned the east half red. And a second sonnet to the same lady called Summer Garden. Winter, false dawns woke me. Thud, thud, thud. Lorries loaded with chipped ice and not quite full. Felt swathed babushkas stooping to chip more. Leningrad's vast pool of widowhood, who also guard the Rembrandts and rank gents, who stand all day with stern, unbending gaze, haloed with Tsars' crowns and Fabergés, their menfolk melted down to monuments. It's their eyes make me shy for a woman who they'd chorus at Niet, Niet, and make me edgy, walking here with you between the statues Veritas, Honor, and Psyche, whom strong passion made forget conditions of darkness and the gods' taboo. This is a poem in Prague, another sonnet, and it's written, my birthday happens to be the 30th of April, and I was walking through Prague and everything was up ready for the May Day procession. Well, the best view you can get of Prague is on the cathedral, and there's a great gargoyle playing a lute with its mouth locked in some eternal note. It's called Prague Spring, on my birthday, 30th of April. A silent scream, the madrigal's top note, puking his wassail on the listening throng, mouthfuls of cumulus, a cobalt fruit. Medusa must have hexed him in mid-song. The finest vantage point in all of Prague's this gagging gargoyles with a stone-locked lute, viewing cherry trees, the blow-ups of Karl Marx, the pioneers will march past and salute. Tomorrow's May, but still a north wind scuffs the plated surface like a maced cuirass, lays on, lays off, gets purchase on, and roughs up the Vltava and makes it glass. The last snow of this year's late, slow thaw dribbles as spring saliva down his jaw. I've been recently working on a very, what is going to be a very long sequence of poems, which is called School of Eloquence. And it's very much about some of the things we've been about this morning, about culture, about class, about language in England. And I used to get tired of people saying, well, with your background, I wonder how you became a poet. And I wrote this little poem called Heredity. The facts in it are true. How you became a poet is a mystery. Wherever did you get your talent from? I say, I had two uncles, Joe and Harry. One was a stammerer, the other dumb. this sequence, the School of Eloquence, is about simple things. It takes the title from Thomson's great history on the making of the English working class. And in 1799, when the backlash of the French Revolution was felt in England, groups of working men who met in pubs to read books, especially books like Tom Paine, The Rights of Man, this kind of thing. Usually they had one, the rest were probably illiterate, and they had groups like the London Corresponding Society and the United Englishmen met regularly to read these works, which were no doubt inflammatory. And there was a special act in 1799 forbidding the United Englishmen and the London Corresponding Society. And we had organisers of these, a man called John Binns, who went on organising the same things under a different cover. And when he was last arrested, he had a little ticket on him which said, "Admit for the season to the School of Eloquence." And these are a sequence of Meredithian sonnets, if you like, which are 16-line sonnets called the School of Eloquence. The first one's called On Not Being Milton, and was written to two poets I met in East Africa, who are members of Frelimo, who the idea of poetry was very simple, in that they had a war of liberation to fight, and that they all they had to do was to write and encourage the people to take part in it. I think that now Frelimo is the present government of Mozambique, and I think these two poets are ministers of education. But we talked about poetry, and I thought about what they'd said. And in English history, the people, the background I came from, which is always silent. That when people want to know what makes you into it, it's not that you Hart Crane when you were 18 or Catullus when you were 20, so much with me now as the whole pressure of generations of silence, a kind of negative thrust into articulation and eloquence. And you find that the actual words of people of the working class in history, the words of the governing class have always been recorded in great detail, in volumes and volumes. They always had their amanuensis, their Boswells. But the people, the whole culture was oral, never had their words recorded unless they were about to be hung, or they were writing their last letter home to their wives. And this, one of the things I try to do in these poems is set words like this, which are the fragments. It's turning the T.S. Eliot thing on its head, really, when he fills his fragments full of bits of Sanskrit and that kind of thing. I'm filling bits of lost working class speech, words my mother used, and so on. And this sets a phrase which is very badly spelled. The spelling is very interesting. He spells writing R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G at the end. The last line is happens to fall metrically perfectly. And it was a letter by Tidd, that was one of the Cato Street conspiracies. You remember the Cato Street conspiracy in 1820 was a plot to assassinate the cabinet. And Tidd, along with other people, was executed in May 1870. And this is from his last letter. I also mentioned something called an Enoch. Now, Enoch is an iron sledgehammer, which was used by the Luddites to smash the frames of the machines. And as they smashed them, they said, Enoch with them, Enoch shall break them, because Enoch was a man called Enoch Taylor of Marsden, between Mansfield and Manchester, made both the sledgehammers and the frames. And that's what I'm talking about when we talk about language this morning, that we make both the sledgehammer and the frame. And this is what this poem's about, On Not Being Milton. On Not Being Milton, for Sergio Vieira and Armando Guebuza. Read and committed to the flames, I call these 16 lines that go back to my roots, my cahier de retour au Pays Natal, my growing luck enough to fit my boots. The stutter of the skull out of the ranks of condescension, class and counterclass thickens with glottals to a lumpen mass of ludding morphemes closing up their ranks. Each swung cast iron Enoch of lead stress, clangs of forged music on the frames of art, the looms of old language smashed apart. 3 cheers for mute ingloriousness. Articulation is the tongue-tides fighting. In the silence round all poetry, we quote Tidd, the Cato Street conspirator, who wrote, "Sir, I am a very bad hand at writing." The next poem is called The Rhubarbarians. You know, one of the tradition here in the American theatre is to, when a mob is present on the stage in England, all they say is rhubarb, 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 rhubarb. And it so happens, there was I struggling to be a poet in Leeds, of places, where people, wise old councillors say, "We have no Leeds School of Poetry, I understand," and this kind of thing. They're very proud of it. It so happens that 99% of English rhubarb is grown in Leeds. But we don't call it rhubarb there. That's the interesting thing. We call it Tusky. So I thought the poem balances the word against our word for it. I mean, since rhubarb is 99% Leeds, and it's a poem about struggling to become a poet and about one's place in history. The motto, like all towns, is a Latin motto to mystify you, like the old Dulce decorum est. We have in Newcastle for the Boer War, and Leeds' motto was pro rege et lege, for the king and law. It so happens that the word Tusky is derived. Rhubarb originally came from Turkey and Russia, so it's a conflation of Turkey and Russia. So Tusky, it's like, this poem is like Bloch's poem, The Scythians. It's sort of the barbarians are crossing over. Again, about who records the words, the historical words that are recorded in those that aren't. And Tusky has got a much more aggressive tone to it. Louis Althusser once said in a letter to Italians that the whole class struggle can at times be encapsulated in the battle for one word against another. The Rhubarbarians. Those glottals glugged like poured pop, each rebarbative syllable remembrancer, raise mob, rhubarb, rhubarb, to a tribune speech, crossing the crackle as the hayricks blaze. The gaffers, blackleg Boswells at their side. Horsefall of Ottewells, if the bugger could, I'd have liked to exact words record, ride up to my saddle girths in Luddite blood. What mob said to the cannons on the mills, shouted to soldier, scab and sentinels, silence, parries and hush on whistling hills, shadow moonlight, playing Nur and spell. It wasn't poetry, though. Nay, wise owl Leeds pro-rege leggy schools. Nobody needs your drills and chanting to parrot right the Tusky of the pikes that night. This is another poem about language and class. It's called National Trust. You know, there's an organization called National Trust which preserves portions of our cultural heritage. This is a poem about, in Derbyshire, there are a lot of mines, lead mines, Old Blue John mines, the Romans mine, and there's one place in the Speedwell Cavern that they have a bottomless pit in, and they never know how deep it was, because one day some gentleman took a convict from the prison and lowered him down and see how deep it was. And he went mad and speechless and couldn't tell them. And I remembered it. I remembered this incident when I was looking into the shaft of the tin mines in Cornwall. Now, Cornwall, not only were the people of Cornwall oppressed, their language was made extinct. The last speaker of Cornish died in about 1777. It's the bicentennial of the death of Cornish was last year. And just as I used the words of Tidd in the other poem, I use a line of Cornish in this, and then translate it into my speech. National trust, bottomless pits. There's one in Castleton, and stout upholders of our law and order one day thought its depth worth wagering on, and borrowed a convict, hush-hush, from his warder, and winched him on and back, flayed, grey, mad, dumb. Not even a good flogging made him holler. Oh, gentlemen, a better way to plumb the depths of Britain's dangling a scholar. Say, here, at the booming shaft at Towanrath, now National Trust, a place where they got tin, those gentlemen who silenced the men's oath and killed the language that they swore it in. The dumb go down in history and disappear, and not one gentleman's been brought to book. Den heptabas agasidia Cornish, the tongueless man gets his land took. This is a poem called Bookends. It's about the day my mother died, and about me and my father sitting in our old seats in the house in Leeds, and about the divisions between us. Bookends. Baked the day she suddenly dropped dead. We chew it slowly, that last apple pie. Shocked into sleeplessness, you're scared of bed. We never could talk much, and now don't try. You're like bookends, the pair of you, she'd say. Og that great, say nothing, sit, sleep, stare. The scholar, me, you, worn out on poor pay. Only our silence made us seem a pair. Not as good for staring in, blue gas. Too regular, each bud, each yellow spike. A night, you need my company pass, and she not here to tell us we're alike. Your life's all shattered into smithereens. Back in our silences, unsullen looks. For all the scotch we drink, what's still to us? Not the 30 or so years, but books, books, books. This is the last of the poems I shall read from this section, The School of Eloquence. It's called Tark. In Leeds, we have this way of saying the, say Tark. Oh, I'm oft at pictures, this kind of glottal stop and before consonants. This is a poem about the extinction of species, the extinction of words that describe things, an extinction of languages and men. It's called Tark. And instead of being 16 lines, it's 18. It's the kind of code at the end that it mentions a Welsh word, Kincarnath. Kincarnath is an elaborate way the Welsh have of making poems alliteratively. And it commemorates certain animals on the brink of extinction, like the Manu code of Papua. And when you read the entry from Manu Code in the Oxford English Dictionary. It says, 1835, the use is recorded, and it says, from some expedition memoir, the Manu Code presented itself twice in our shooting excursions, and we killed both the male and the female. You remember that it's about poems as preservers of things that die, and even that being threatened as a species too. The poem as a guarantee of immortality is also a threatened species. You remember Theodore Roosevelt, I think about 1899, he said that when I hear of the destruction of a species, I feel as if all the works of some great writer had perished. This is called Tark. Silence and poetry have their own reserves. The numbered creatures flourish less and less. A language near extinction best preserves the deepest grammar of our nothingness. Not only dodo, oryx, and great auk waddle their Todd tat monster ark, but leg, night, origin in crush people's talk. Tongues of fire, last witness, mouthing dark. Now, when the future couldn't be much darker, there being fewer epithets for sun, and Cornish and the Toland Restsprache name both the animal and hunter's gun. Celebrate before things go too far. Papua's last reported Manu Code, the pygmy hippo of the Côte d'Ivoire, and Upper Guinea's oviparous toad. Or mourn in Latin their imminent death, then translate these poems into Kincarneth. And maybe, have I time for one more? Last one. This is a poem I always like to finish with because it's a dark poem and about a dark time in my life. It's about resilience. I wrote a section of poems called Sentences about my trip to Latin America, to Cuba, Brazil, and so on. And this is a poem about going to Brazil. Or at least that's one of the things it's about. It's also about the resilience of children who suffer. It's written at a bad time in my life when I was both very poor and when my daughter, I just had a very terrible accident on the Great North Road in England, which the Great North Road runs from London, the capital, to Edinburgh, the other capital. And I live very near it. And I was walking, my daughter had her legs crushed under a lorry. And I was walking back from the hospital past the place where she'd been run over, past the traffic light, which was going red and green and orange. And the spray from the lorries is very wet. I was walking, so I had no money either. And I remembered, as I passed this place, a little girl of the same age I met when I was in Brasilia. The first person I ever met and talked in Brasilia was a little girl called Teresinha, who was about, my daughter was 6 when she had this accident, this girl was about 6, who lived with a family of about 7 or 8 under, I mean, you know, Brasilia is like a museum of 21st century architecture, and it's designed for the motor car and not for people who walk. But they were living, this family, there's a national theatre there. It's like a flat-top pyramid, like the sort of the Aztecs used to throw sacrifices down. And there's an entrance like this, a slope, a ramp, and they, like a bushman's window, I suppose, they lived under here for shelter, and also because it's close to this fountain, this Lua fountain, the Fonte Nossa in Brasilia, which is, remember, it's in the middle of a desert. And there's this vast fountain which goes to great height, which changes colour and shape to make. And every day she used to go for drinking water from the Fonte Luminosa in a little tin. And she had to cross all these very dangerous roads because you weren't really expected to be a pedestrian in central Brasilia. And so it's about her and it's about my daughter. It's called Fonte Luminosa, the luminous fountain. It's about that fountain in Brazilian. It's also about the luminous fountain of children's resilience and of life. It's part of things called sentences. Each poem, the form of each poem is one sentence, long sentence. The sentences are also in the sense of being moral pronouncements about man and society. Fonte Luminosa. Walking on the Great North Road with my back towards London through showers of watery sleet, my cracked rubber boot soles croak like African bullfrogs, and the buses and lorries that swish like a whiplash laid on without intermission backswing send a spray squelching over from tires skywards, stop red, go green, caution amber, and at the crossing where you got your legs crushed, I remember the Fonte Luminosa, Brasilia's musical laser, skirting a polychrome plumage, the fans of rich pashas, a dancer of dyed ostriches, making park Chevrolets glisten, people seem sweaty. And when yellowing Lope Terezinha, the eldest, though your age, of the children all huddled under the fancy entrance of the National Theatre, comes and scoops from the churned, illuminated waters a tinful for drinking and cooking, and goes gingerly to ingenious roads where cars need never once stop at Belicias or crossings, intersect, crash or slow down. The drops that she scatters are not still orange or purple, still greenish or gorgeous in any way, or still gushing, but slightly clouded like quartz. And at once they're sucked back into Brazil like a whelk retracting, like the tear that drains back into your eye as once more you start coming through the rainbowing spindrift and fountains of your seventh anesthesia.